soon as I get the notification that we're on, and we should be good.
So funny, Andrew. Like you have to be. So in today's day and age, you can't just be what you are. You have to be a technician. You have to know lighting. You have to know technology. You know computers, right? It's like so different. It's so wild.
Yeah, that is true. When at the start of the pandemic, I was doing everything myself, and then fortunately, our video team started getting to now.
Oh, you know what? Let me check my set.
We're losing your sound a little.
Yeah. Do we have to be sound engineers? Let's add that to it.
Yeah. All right. Is that better at all?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and let me.
Yep,
just
we got the we're on. So yeah, cool. It really is different, you know. And like moving forward, it's almost like everybody has to kind of learn how to do all this stuff with ease.
You got to have a workaround,
right?
You got to have a workaround. If you don't have a workaround, you can get lost in this joint.
And I don't know about you guys. See, you guys seem very patient. I get really rattled when I'm trying to do it and it doesn't work. And I'm not sure what to do, and I'm by myself.
Okay, so Christine sees us. For some reason, I'm not seeing us, but I'm going to take Christine's word for it.
Okay.
And we're recording too, so that's going to be good. So those of you who are watching, thank you very much for joining us on Job Seeker Nation. Of course, we're here weekly, every Wednesday at 1 p.m. sharp as possible. And nevertheless, you know Jack Kelly, you know me, want to bring on our special guest, Andrew Seaman, senior editor of LinkedIn News for Jobs and Careers. How are you, sir?
Yeah, how are you doing?
Good. Your sound is still not coming in as well as it should. It's hard to say whether it's my end or your end. I hear Jack just fine.
Okay.
Okay. Yep. Michael's seeing this. Thank you, Michael, for letting us in. Give the rest of you who are watching, give us a holler as we just let us know where you're from, and if you have questions during the show, feel free to type it in the chat so we can see you and hear you and all that kind of stuff while we discuss our topics of the day and the hour. One of the things that we should get right to on our show, we usually talk about the jobs report. Jack wasn't here to talk about the jobs report last week, but he usually starts off the beginning of the month when we get it to talk about the unemployment and how things are looking and the ushering of all those great jobs that are happening. Jack?
You know, I'm glad you brought it up in that there's almost 1 million people received new jobs last month. And it's a little feedback. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. Now you're better.
Okay. So so last month, about almost 1 million people had new jobs. And it definitely, to me, and I'll be curious because you follow this out even way more closely than I do, but it does feel like we've turned the corner. It seems that, I don't want to go as far as to say the pandemic is over and then we're in this new paradigm, but it feels that directionally we're going to a good place. Goldman Sachs has said, hey, they expect a hiring boom. JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon said we're in a Goldilocks economy. Jay Powell, the Fed chair, says we're in an inflection point. So it does seem that way. And from recruiting, we definitely received more job orders in the last few weeks and the last few months than we have in a while. What do you guys see? Like, are you seeing the same thing?
Andrew, what are your thoughts?
I think so. I think we're definitely seeing hiring pick up. Obviously, the unemployment, fresh unemployment numbers from last week were very positive, at least since the start of the pandemic. And I assume, or at least hope, that'll keep trending down. And, when we look at overall unemployment, there's still a lot of people unemployed. So obviously that is very unfortunate. But I think what's happening is that a lot of companies are starting to feel more secure about their future. And that's probably one of the most important things when it comes to actually creating jobs. Because when we saw the pandemic first hit, we saw those massive layoffs immediately. And a lot of that wasn't because businesses were hit hard immediately like that. It was because uncertainty just skyrocketed. So as a protection act, a lot of companies just started laying people off, basically guarding against whatever might happen in the future. So, you know, I think companies are feeling a little bit more steady. They're seeing that, at least in the United States, 50% of people have at least had one shot of the vaccine. And, you know, if they're getting the Moderna or Pfizer, a lot of that protects, a lot of them are protecting pretty high. So even with that one shot, people are getting some level of protection. So I think a lot of the companies are ending up being a little bit more sure-footed and saying, you know, we can move ahead and we can hire this person. And also we need to remember that companies are getting better at hiring remotely. So it's not, you know, the fact that they're sort of waiting and seeing anymore about how they're going to hire. They've been doing this now for more than a year. Probably not more than a year. Probably a lot of them took a month or two off from hiring. But, you know, you have a lot of them who know how to hire remotely now. So I think that's a really good thing too, because they could say, hey, we can onboard someone remotely and then hopefully bring them into the office once we go back. So I think there's a number of factors that are sort of converging right now, and hopefully they keep moving in the right direction.
What do you think about the remote versus hybrid in office? Do you have a feel how this is all going to play out?
I was actually just having a conversation with someone about this today, and I think what's interesting is everyone is looking at the immediacy of what happens when people return to the office, but a lot of that is still going to be dictated by protections about the virus. So you're going to have people who are still masked, you're going to have people who are still socially distanced, and obviously there are offices and there are workplaces that have been back to work for quite a while. But I think what's more interesting is thinking maybe a year down the road, hopefully the virus really is just sort of an endemic sort of flu-like thing where people get their vaccinations and life goes on. I want to see what life is like at that point, because I think that's where we're going to start to see what the future of work really looks like from now. Because, you know, I think people are going to go back and there's going to be companies that are going to be trying a lot of different things. You know, I work at LinkedIn, so I'm sure they're going to be trying some things, and there's going to be other companies that are going to try other things. And we're going to get all those wonderful studies from the Harvard Business Review. We're going to get all of those little case studies about what worked, what didn't work. And I think a year, 2, 3 years down the road, that's where we're going to see actual changes to the workplace, because people are going to say, oh, that worked really well, or that worked really well. So I think from a workplace point of view, it's actually going to be a really exciting time, because people are going to experiment more than they ever had. You know, they always, like, everyone had like the open to work or open floor plan or open work plans and things like that. And people try little things, but you basically have all of these giant companies that are going to be going back right now, and they're going to just be throwing stuff at the wall. So I think that you're going to get a lot of just innovation and practices. And you're also going to get a lot of companies that say, hey, we do want some people back in the office. I think Reed Hastings from Netflix, I think he was one of the first people to say, hey, listen, it's great that people want to work from home, but we also want them together because there's really a benefit to that. So there's a lot of things in the air right now, but it'll be exciting to see what happens maybe 2, 3 years down the road.
Yeah, I think that when we look at the whole spectrum, I think the people who are doing well are the people who really communicated really well, like Microsoft and Google, who gave a definitive, we will not come back into the office until this time, and gave it far enough time to where there's certainty, at least as things are being figured out, that hopefully there's likely enough time for people to make adjustments and make pivots. That makes people feel really good about it. And those, for the employees, people who are job seekers, at least also know what they're getting into. If we're not coming back into the office until 2022, then I know I'm going to be remote at least for that long, unless there's some kind of turnaround. But I think there's a lot of people are buffing at the communication where we're not really sure and we really want to try something and all of that. And people who are really savvy careerists and people who've prepared what they should, they're saying, but you are too uncertain. And I think there is such a thing as where you turn people around and start to look to their competition, because the communication's a lot more streamlined and there's a lot more certainty as for how the company's going to look and run, at least for that amount of time. And I think that's a very key element to getting more people back into the office. Of course, more people back into the office, or a steady flow of people. That means for people who are searching are going to go with that more so than the catch as can style of communication that we've seen. Your thoughts on that, Andrew?
I think no, I think you're right. In fact, I think Robert Half put out a survey recently, and I could be wrong, but I believe I saw this, where Robert Half did a study, and I think it was like 63% of people basically said that depending on what the return to office will look like for their company, they may look for another job. So I think if there's companies that say you have to return to work immediately, then you're going to end up in a position where some employees who maybe would have stayed with you if you had a more flexible policy is going to get sort of the wandering eye in terms of a career space, where they're going to say, I don't know, our competitor's looking pretty good and they're going to let me work from home 3 days a week instead of coming into the office 5 days a week.
Right.
I think it's obviously good for some companies, because I think smart companies, and I assume we probably saw this a little bit early in the pandemic after layoffs, is that smart companies know how to take advantage of those opportunities. And they probably said, hey, there's these layoffs right now, and we're going to go after some of the talent that we really want. I think Google did this during the Great Recession. So Google really scaled up and brought on really great talent during the 2008
big time
financial crisis. And I think other companies, hopefully they've learned from them, so they could say, hey, we're going to beef up our recruiting efforts or our talent acquisition efforts to really get some of these people. And I think the return to office may give one of those opportunities.
It's so interesting you say that, Andrew, because it seems to me what Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Amazon are doing is they're using their office as a competitive, marketing tool to attract and retain the best talent. Because if you look, they're building, for instance, Facebook, they bought REI's like awesome campus. It's beautiful. Amazon is building this really great second headquarters in Virginia. You have dog parks and bicycle trails. Microsoft is like, they're all building these cool things. And I guess the undercurrent is this: hey, if you're, particularly for Gen Zs and younger millennials, it seems the subtle thing is like, hey, rather than being stuck at home, being in your small cramped apartment, living with your parents, hey, you could come into this awesome place and this is gonna be great. And then if you have a choice, where do I want to work? And you say, hey, is it going to be a place that's super cool? I have kombucha on tap. I have all these kind of cool amenities. Or do I want to be stuck, at home by myself? So I think that's like, you can have that, but then you can have the other extreme, like with Jack Dorsey and Twitter saying, hey, you can work from home forever. And then you're going to appeal to that. So, right. It seems to me like they're kind of trying to position themselves. Hey, here's what we're going to do. And this is why you want to come to us instead of one of our competitors.
Yes, I for one would really like to get back to the office. I live in a small New York City apartment and would like a desk again. That's not.
I want to get out. Get out, see people.
But I think you're right. One thing that I've heard from a lot of economists during the pandemic, because there's been so many pieces about sort of the death of cities. So you hear about New York will never recover, or San Francisco will never recover. But what I hear a lot of economists saying is that there will definitely be difficult times and things don't ever go necessarily back to how they were. Yeah. But one of the things that economists have been saying is that there are forces that bring people to these places. And they've been bringing them to these places for, hundreds of years at this point. So there are these forces that will likely draw people back to them. Obviously, there are people who left the city. There are people who went to Connecticut or upstate New York. And, if you look at home prices now around New York City, it's all astronomical because people have left the 5 boroughs and they're trying to find sort of the suburban paradise. But you're going to get a lot of people that say, hey, now's a good time to move to the city. I always wanted to move to the city, and rents are lower. And then you do have these offices. So I think if you look back at, even the pioneer days, you had the rivers, you had the water supply. So that's what created these spaces then. And you have these companies that are still going to be based here and still going to have the gathering spots. So I think over time, you're just naturally going to see everything come back in terms of like, these are the main event areas. So, and like you said, companies like Amazon and Facebook and all these places, they really do put a lot of effort into creating spaces that people want to come to. And maybe that does look different. Maybe they don't have these desks anymore. Maybe they have more communal spaces, but that's still going to be a huge component of bringing people there. Because if you talk to like engineers basically get their pick of where they want to work because they are so in demand. And I think, if you talk to them, why did you pick Google over Facebook, or why did you pick Facebook over Twitter? Sometimes it comes down to, hey, they have a better cafeteria. And I know that sounds insane, but if you see some of these cafeterias,
it's nice.
It is a decision. And, if they're going to give you this amazing lunch every day, then that's a factor in your decision.
Well, it's going to be tough for like smaller, mid-sized companies, I think, to compete.
Yeah,
and that's part of the puzzle. I think where it's coming in. There's two factors I think that we also need to consider, and the job seekers could consider as far as something that they act on. One is smaller companies have an advantage too, in the sense that they're more flexible. They haven't quite got the big building yet, so they can say the only way that will work is remote, and that we'll be doing that for a long time, because to build up that kind of capital at this particular time is kind of crazy. But the other part is that there's a lot of clearing out that's going to be done, because a lot of people are not going back to those big buildings. So are large companies going to be big enough to cop that land, or is it that the real estate is going to skyrocket so much it may chase people out of those properties, and it might be more economical to work at home, especially with the small business. They're trying to figure out how to get more people and to have less assets that they won't need. So there's two school of thoughts there. Now I really think that as a job seeker, I want to know, okay, if I want some surety here, a small company might be something I want to look at, because at least I know for the next 2-3 years, they're going to be steady as far as the place they're going to work and where I want to work.
Yeah. And I think actually on the flip side, what's funny is you're going to have a lot of larger companies that are going to go into those spaces that maybe the small companies occupied, and snapping up really cheap rents, because, in New York City, you have these huge spaces, and obviously, I think there's still probably much more empty spaces than there are occupied
New York
spaces.
City, there's no such thing as being cheap.
Yes,
there's
that's
no
true.
Cheap
but when there's
like Chicago,
yeah,
no cheap.
but when there's such little demand, the rents go down, especially in office space. So
this is
lot of the larger companies will probably be snapping up deals on the rent and say, hey, can you give me this deal for 10, 15 years? Mm-hmm. And then, they're sort of sitting pretty once things recover, because they're paying cheap rents comparatively. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out and which gamble probably works out the best.
Yeah, Jack, final thoughts?
I'm predicting New York's going to go back, because I grew up in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn before it was all cool and hipster and all that kind of stuff. And I remember, I was a kid, I remember in the 70s and then even the early 80s, it was terrible. Like, you would talk about going into the city, right? And it sounded like ominous, to go in there. And you would go into, Times Square, and they would have porno theaters there. You didn't have Disney, what they do now. And, there's, if you remember the headlines of Ford, then President Ford to New York City, dropped dead. And you had the same feel for a while in New York, that same scare. But then, I don't know, it seemed to dissipate. It seems like it's people kind of saying, hey, you know what? We left, and I'll give you an example. A lot of places were going down to Florida and saying, hey, yeah. And then all of a sudden you hear the opposite. Well, Florida, it's not really the same. Let's start coming back. Right. All of a sudden it turned around. So I'm betting on New York. I'm betting that it's going to definitely come back.
Yeah.
San Francisco, though. I can't speak about that. I'm not sure. But this is, Andrew, this goes to your point you brought up earlier. To me, it's exciting to kind of just figure out like what's going to happen next. It's almost as if, once we step out of it, could it be the roaring 20s, where we're like, everybody's so happy just to get out and you're vaccinated and you can do stuff. And there's so much pent up demand because people were were at home, they can spend money. So they have, their funds were kind of increasing. So they want to go travel. So it could be really exciting. People could start saying, hey, maybe I'm working 2-3 days at home and I don't have to schlep in, going commuting from Long Island to New York, wherever. So it almost like opens up a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, and I think too, it also opens up the fact that really any job, or at least jobs that had been that went remote during the pandemic, and they may go back, someone can actually still make a case to be remote because people have done it before and people have opened that door. Now that door kind of remains open, and if somebody who has leverage in their job search and they've done their research and they have the talent and they have all the things aligned, they can still say, hey, I would rather work from home. Is there a way to work that out? So not every, and we've all said that some of us want to go back into the office, some of us want to stay remote, some of us want a hybrid. But I think ultimately a job seeker will have more control because they see historically that pivot was made, and that there's not going to be an employer who's going to have the hard pivot to drive away the talent that's going to be at their doors. So if we could, we did kind of cover a hybrid of two subjects because something has happened very recently that I want to kind of bring into the mix, the fact that there are job seekers who are also passing on the lower end wage, passing on opportunities because the unemployment stimulus and unemployment extra $600 has kind of exceeded the amount that they're being offered by their former jobs. And I think that's a very interesting thing because people are literally turning down opportunities. I don't think it's particularly a smart idea, though I can understand the conundrum is that I'm getting paid more now than me coming back to work. So I know we could discuss whether it's a smart move or not move, but is that something that maybe we can get another peek at the future as far as let's just put out there that $600 won't be offered forever as an extra.
Yeah.
But that kind of does tell a lot about how the mindset of people right now, doesn't it? Any comments about that, Andrew?
Well, I think there's a few factors going on. There was a good piece in the New York Times recently that basically said that there are, obviously the unemployment additional payments may be a factor in that. There's some conflicting research. And I do remember at the start of the pandemic when the first recovery bill or sort of support bill was put through Congress, there was a question about, what will happen with the labor market if people are getting more than they do if they were to go back to work. And there had been research that basically said, listen, if you do pay people more in terms of unemployment, it actually increases the wages, and which isn't necessarily a terrible thing. So if you have people who are in the service industry and they're getting more from unemployment, it may encourage restaurant owners and bar owners, people like that, to say, hey, we do have to increase our wages if we want to get talent back. There's another thing going on too, which is I think a lot of people, they might still be fearful of that profession. And if they can buy a little bit of time, they may be thinking about a career pivot. So it may not necessarily just be that they're getting more money and money talks, jobs walk. It might be that maybe it's giving them additional time to get by while they look for something that says that they're going to, move into human resources, sales, or something that's more 9 to 5 than the service industry. So there's, I think, a few factors going in there. It's not necessarily great to turn down jobs, obviously, but as long as you're not wasting their time or you're not doing anything like that, I don't think it necessarily serves you wrong to say, I think I have something better coming along. It's not until you say yes that you get into trouble, real trouble. But I don't know if it's necessarily just the additional payments that are going to be keeping people from accepting low wage jobs or things that get paid less. But obviously, it remains to be seen, and it differs for everyone.
Sure.
See, I agree. I think it's a combination of things. So I agree with you because are there some people maybe who just say, hey, I have an extra $300 plus my stimulus check and I'm just going to chill. Okay, maybe. But I think a lot of people say, hey, maybe I have a sick relative. Maybe I have, something that I'm concerned at. Even if I have the vaccine, I'm still worried. So I may not want to go outside for the job that I'm doing. It also may be, hey, you know what? If I could get this time, as you were saying, Andrew, and figure out what do I want to do next? So this buys me some time, which you don't get too often in your career, where you can kind of take a pause and say, all right, what do I want to do? Maybe I go back to school, maybe I get some certifications, maybe I just use this time to speak with, hey, I'm going to speak with Mark and Andrew, pick their brains, get some ideas. So it's maybe a little bit of a combination of all those things where they're kind of using this time. And I think it's kind of money well spent, from the government to make people kind of think, okay, what do I do? And how do I now navigate my career? And how do I kind of figure out the next step and not just race into something or not put yourself in harm's way? If you got to go outside and you have a sick family member at home, that's you put you in a really tough spot. So it's it's very interesting.
Yeah, Debria, who's a regular who joins us, thanks for your comment, Debria. She says, also, I'm finding that due to it being so competitive as more and more people are looking for jobs, companies are not paying what they were a year ago, which is, there's truth to that, because there's some industries that are essential that actually got COVID pay at this particular time last year, because they got a little bump because they were
got a little about that hazard heroes pay kind of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So people are looking at that. Maybe, I don't know if they keep that figure in mind, but interesting enough is that there's so many factors that are involved. It's hard to say exactly what's going to be the penny factor, but the companies that are willing to compete are going to be the ones that are going to be able to win people for talent, and for the fact that they're also making it safe for people to return to work. And I think that's also a factor when you look at it. Any additional thoughts about that, Andrew?
I think that there is definitely some industries that may be paying less. There are some that I think, one thing that economists have said is that the recession that has been created because of the pandemic is unlike many others in the past. And there are some industries that have continued on like nothing has happened. There are some industries that have obviously been devastated. And so that is obviously a factor. And I think that where people are going, where they're pivoting to, and what their skills are, all plays into that equation. There is, I think if you do look at household income after recessions, it typically does decrease a little bit. So maybe that's because people lost work or because they are getting paid less. But overall, I think, the most important thing to remember is when you go in there, it shouldn't be anything drastically different than what they were paying before. So do your research when you're going into one of those conversations. Have basically, your security in mind. So say, I can't accept below this amount of money. Then talk to people and say what you should be expecting for your skill level, for your experience, things like that. Go in there with that. And then when they start throwing out numbers, say, hey, that's really great, but there are people who are in this industry who are making X amount with the same experience and skills that I have. And if they're still paying them for that amount of skills and experience, that's what your skills and experience are worth. So even if they say, oh, well, you have to understand it's a recession, we're still recovering or something, you could basically say, listen, if there are people out there who are making that amount of money for the same work that I'm going to be doing, that means the market value of those skills is still this amount of money, regardless of the recession, because if they're making it, so should I. So just do your research before going in there.
Excellent advice. Jack?
So, I sort of morphed, like a lot of things over the pandemic. And in the early days, it was really quiet. Then it got, a little better, but better is a very relative term because it wasn't great, a little better. And I did feel that a lot of companies they were just operating under the assumption, hey, because remember in March and April, how many millions of people down there, just mind-boggling. Figuring, hey, they're going to be hat in hand, they need a job, so we don't have to pay a lot, we can ask a lot. But over time, I noticed it's trending upwards, where they're being a little bit more understanding, they're getting it. And I think we're going to actually get, this is what we were talking about earlier, I think we can get this space where it's going to become a war for talent again, where you're going to see things, states are opening up. And Andrew, I agree with you. When management feels comfortable and optimistic, that's a game changer. Because then they feel, okay, we feel the future is bright, we're going to roll out new products, maybe we're going to make some acquisitions, what have you, and they're going to hire. But when they don't really hire. So I think we're going to probably go from where it wasn't so great to it's going to really turn around. And I think then job seekers are going to be in the driver's seat after a while.
Yeah, and we did see for a little bit, and I think right now it's kind of that job seekers market in some of the industries, and there's others are returning to the reality because the hazard pay has kind of run out. So they're not going to be paying the same anymore, especially if you were a nurse, a doctor, or somebody who went to the front lines. They were getting 3 times what they normally were getting. Reports of nurses making $100,000 in 3 months is just insanity. Being that was, some people were able to do it and travel and other factors considered, while the rest of the world was kind of waiting for Godot in some sense, that they had to wait for things to mull over. I do want to bring in a little bit of this, the Job Seeker Nation report. That's, I think, is important to our study, and I'm picked out one part of it is that how long people have been out of work. 30 people who respond to the Job Seeker Nation report. There were about 1,500 that were responded to the report. 36% of them have been out of work 6 to 12 months. 35% have been out of work for over a year. 28% have been looking for a job 6 to 12 months. And 23% have been looking for a job for over a year. Now, in terms of, for some people who've come from devastated industries, of course, they might have likely have fallen to that, and they may have acquired the skills that didn't translate to other industries. I can understand that, but it's interesting that people are in the mindset that they can now be a year out from having work and also leverage the fact that they're keeping some bills somewhat paid. And we're talking about 1 out of 3 job seekers. In your estimation, for people who really want to get back to work, what kind of strategies you think are you guys seeing now that seem to be working and seem to be penetrating different markets or changing careers and so forth? And you can throw it from any angle if you like. Jack, we'll start with you.
I think people who have been long-term unemployed, it's devastating. I think what I see as my recruiter hat, there's an erosion of their self-confidence and their self-esteem. So at the time where you need to come across confident, motivated, you're not feeling it. And then when you go to an interview, it's hard for a lot of people to shake that off, to shake off the resentment, the frustration. So then they go in and the interviewer picks up on it. And in a market that's not hot and they feel that there's a lot of candidates out there, it's very easy to say, hey, Jack, thanks. It was a pleasure meeting you. We'll keep in touch. And then it just makes that person feel even worse and you go down that spiral. So it's a really pernicious, really tough situation to be in. And I would say it's easier said than done, but it's almost they have to kind of pull back, refocus on what they're doing that's working, what they're doing that's not working, try to divorce themselves from all that negativity and to try to kind of just reframe it and come in with more of a positive attitude. Now, that's not the complete answer, but at least it's a start to start turning it around. I mean, do you
Andrew,
see that
thoughts
in
on
the
that?
data, Andrew, from like what's for the long-term unemployed, that it's just because it doesn't seem to stop. It seems that's those
Yeah,
are-
I've definitely seen sort of similar numbers with long-term unemployment when it comes to, and long-term unemployment typically is 6 months or more. And I think,
Mhm.
it really depends on the person, because there's probably, like everything, a combination of factors that are leading to this. There are some people who maybe genuinely don't know how to job search. One of the things that I often did was talk to people to say, how do you job search? And what I noticed is that once you got to sort of senior management level of people, they would always come to me and say, hey, thanks for your question, but I don't have to job search. People come to me, my friends will say, hey, why don't you talk to my friend Bob down at this place, and don't worry about me, I don't have to job search. And I think what happened, especially during this recession and the pandemic, is that a lot of companies, they look to cut the proverbial fat of their employment rosters, and a lot of times they start in middle management, and that would be senior managers. They would say, you have 5, 6 direct reports, but they can be lumped under 2 other sort of managers in that area, and we get rid of a head count. So there might be fewer jobs in that rank than there were before. So that might be something that's hurting them. Plus, they may not know how to job search effectively. Then there are people who, they haven't job searched in a long time. And, I think a lot of people, they're just sort of discouraged at this point. So they end up getting unemployed, and they start just applying everywhere. And they don't talk to people. They don't take the time to figure out, okay, what are my next steps? They just say, okay, my thing is that I have to apply to as many places as quickly as possible. And obviously, I think, the data always bears that out, that it doesn't really work that well. There are people who do get interviews. There are people who do get jobs that way. I think a lot of times people get scared that, oh, I'm never going to get a job that way. But, like anything, you still have to be smart about how you're applying. And people just, they don't do that. They figure that they have to be quick more than anything else. So I think people get discouraged, and then they let 2 or 3 days go by, and then they don't submit applications, or they're not job searching effectively. But then there are other people who, they're having trouble with interviews. They're having trouble hearing back from people, and it may not necessarily be their fault. They may live in an area that's super depressed because of the recession and the pandemic. So I think there's just so many different factors, and I think for each person, what's great to do is basically sit down with a few people and say, hey, can I borrow 10 minutes of your time, 15 minutes of your time, and ask them what they think about the local job market, what they think about you as a candidate. Even if it's not really within your industry, you could go to someone who maybe works for personnel at a local company, or a friend who has a job, and say, what's your company doing? And, it's not because you want to apply there necessarily, but it's because you just want to know what's happening in your backyard. And then you could say, like, hey, if I came to interview with your company and they asked you to interview me, what would you think? What would you view my resume? And I think almost just doing that sort of diagnostics will help, identify any weaknesses, and, tell them to be honest. Because I always hated in college or high school when the teacher would say, exchange papers, and everyone would just say, oh, we all did great. And it's like, no, that's not helping anyone. So tell them, be constructive. If I was a real candidate and we didn't know each other, what would you really say to me? So I think doing that homework, doing that legwork will help identify any issues, and then you could start addressing them. So that would be my suggestion, to really figure out where you are, and then create a list and start working through those.
That's great advice. Did you ever think, starting as a journalist, that you'd become this career guru? The cards, or just happened?
Well, it just happened. But what's interesting is that I think I graduated from undergrad in 2010, which was sort of the height of the bad job market of the Great Recession.
Great timing. Yeah.
So I took the coward's way out and went to grad school. And then
Dude, smart move. That's what you gotta do.
And I'm still paying for it. Yeah. But then when I got out of grad school, I was very fortunate to go into a job. And what I think I found is that journalism is actually a really good training course to figure out how to navigate the larger job market, because
Mhm.
first of all, you know, the threat of layoffs always loom over you, but second of all, working within journalism to figure out what you're going to do is like changing careers.
Mhm.
So, you know, when I started out going to journalism school, I really wanted to just be a political journalist. So I did a lot of internships at USA Today, in DC, and I was just covering Congress, the White House, things like that, just sort of general politics and elections and things like that. And that was really fun. And then when I graduated grad school, I went back to Reuters and I was covering primarily the Affordable Care Act.
Mhm.
And after that, I was like, you know what? It's better for my career and job security if I pivot into the science of medicine. So, you know,
That's a
I had,
change from,
yeah,
all right.
yeah. So I had to think about, you know, how am I going to do this? Am I going to, you know, I'm covering health policy, but I sometimes have to cover sort of sciencey stuff.
Well, that makes sense.
So
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah,
I didn't
and
think of
then
that.
like
Okay.
you have to do it
Yeah.
slowly, and you have to build up your reputation, and eventually you do get the street cred where you can make that pivot. And you know, so once you start doing that, and then you tell people like this is how you build that credibility, it's a lot like sort of the being someone who can give job advice. And you know, what's wonderful is about when I came to LinkedIn, I started doing my newsletter on the side. So Get Hired was never supposed to be my full-time job. It was never.
Mhm.
It was just supposed to be sort of something I did, you know, for a few hours a week, and then it sort of got away from me, as I tell people. And but what's really nice is that, you know, interviewing people all the time about this, you know, it's the best sort of masterclass you can get. So when you talk
Absolutely.
to people in HR, when you talk to people who train other people to do interviews, or when you talk to recruiters, you start to piece together like what are the strategies, what are realistic things for people to do. So I still view myself as sort of someone who's interviewing people and elevating their voices. But at the same time, it's fun to sort of learn how to navigate that space, and because it's really it's so nuanced in terms of, you know, what's happening. And like anything, it's still largely a gamble for most people, because you know, you could tell them to do all the right things and they could do all the right things, but at the end of the day, it relies on someone else to make those decisions. So
Mhm.
you know, when people, you know, they're defeated, obviously, because I think everyone falls in love with jobs before they get them, even though you tell them not to. But it could just be like that person's cousin applied for the same position, and
Mhm.
unfortunately they got it. So it's a really interesting space. And you know, I think what I like about my career is that I started out covering healthcare, and what I really liked about that was it's something that was so integral to everyone's lives. You know, regardless of, you know, the stock market could go up and down, but there's a really good section of the population that doesn't care about that.
Mhm.
But if you tell them, you know, this is what you could do every day to reduce your risk of like having a stroke or something like that, they sort of perk up, because everyone has a brain,
Mhm.
everyone has a vascular
Yeah.
system. And the same thing with a job. You know, everyone at, you know, regardless of who they are, has some relationship with the job market. Either it's someone who helps them because they can't take part in the job market or the labor market, or it's because they actually participate in it. And you know, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to sort of pivot myself and find these wonderful things. And that's why I actually really like working at LinkedIn, is because, you know, I don't have to be a pitch person for LinkedIn, because that's actually not part of my job, which is nice. But, you know, LinkedIn, we all strive to sort of, you know, educate people to, you know, be part of the workforce and create economic opportunities for themselves. And when I think about it, that's really what journalism is too, because you give people the information they need to succeed to take control of their daily lives. And so there's a lot of overlap there that I really appreciate.
Yeah.
You come across that you're really passionate about it too. You come across really, you know, genuine and authentic, and you like the subject matter, which is so awesome. And
Yeah, it is a lot of fun.
I can see why, because there's so many things for you to be involved with, especially from your platform. So that there's so many stories to hear and so many things going on. So it's, and then you it sounds like you also have, you know, you're headed all these different industries, all these different sectors, all these kind of professions. So for you, probably kind of just so much going on.
Yeah, definitely. Like, you know, and it's good to be at LinkedIn where we have all this data. and we could look at it or whatever, but it's really the stories that tell us what's going on, because I think I owe that to my time at USA Today, because USA Today back in the day, I can't really speak for what they do now, they did trend stories, so it was always sort of like, it's great that this is happening in like Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, or wherever a story was happening, but they would say, where else is it happening? And you would find other people, and it's great to say that this is happening in like 15 states or 20 states, but that doesn't mean much unless you could find the people behind that. And I think one of the things, despite the horribleness of the pandemic and all the costs that came with it, is that people are much more open and honest, I think, now about their jobs and their job searches. Before the pandemic, when I would put out stuff to say like, hey, tell me about your job search, or tell me about this, I would hear crickets back. Or I would get people who would direct message me, and I would say, hey, it would be great if you could post that on your profile and I could incorporate it into my newsletter or something like that. Or would you just agree to, sit down with me and have a chat that I could put in my newsletter?
Mhm.
And I would say 95% of people said no. They didn't want people to know they were job searching. They didn't want people to know that they were maybe going through a tough time. But the pandemic, I think, really changed that very quickly, where, and maybe it's because you had a lot of people who were millennials and from generations that were much more used to sharing that were affected by it. And maybe that spurred older people who maybe were a little bit less comfortable also sort of add their voice to it, because they felt that, had to compete in that sort of exchange of ideas. But people are much more open to it now. And I think that's actually pretty healthy from what I've seen.
But it also leads to success. The more people you tell, the more people are going to be engaged in helping you get results.
Yeah, I always believe that. And even I had a very close acquaintance who, the one time they were miserable at their job, and I said, well, did you tell your friends? Because they lived in an area that, if you worked in one industry, everyone in that industry knew you. And I said, did you tell your friends? And they looked at me and they literally said, are you crazy? And I said, no. I said, if you don't tell people you need help, how are they going to help you? And right. And they never took my advice, but and they actually never got a new job. But yeah, it was just sort of when I told them, hey, you should probably tell people that you want a new job. It's not like they're going to broadcast it to the world, but they could keep their ears open in case they hear something.
Yeah, that's why I think it's more important for people to ask for more information than just the ask itself. People are more bent on wanting to get the quick hit and be led somewhere, rather than asking for information and intel that will inform them, that will inform their job search, that will help inform their resume, that will help them even redirect other people, be helpful to other people. If you're just asking about the job and what the bottom line is, then you're not really helping yourself for the future and really future-proofing your job searches. Ultimately, what you suggested, and you're asking people in what we call informational interviews, and the fact that you're asking, hey, what is it like? How did you get there? How can I accumulate some of that experience without having worked there yet? How did you do it? People asking the more of the what and how will answer a lot of questions, and trying to ask the give me and the why you won't. And that's where people end up in this corner, and they can't seem to paint themselves out of it. As we've seen during this pandemic, people start to rely on their basic instincts. Ultimately, when they think that they're not going to get a job, then they kind of go back to what they know is the spring and praying effect, and that's unfortunate.
Definitely.
So, Jack, did you have any other?
It's interesting. To go back to what Andrew was saying, I see that shift too. Pre-pandemic, if let's say the three of us would just meet at random, right? And we say, well, good. Oh, great. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. I mean, now we probably, you probably do hear this all the time during the day. You speak to someone, how you doing? And they're going to tell you how they're doing. They're going to say, I'm at home. I'm going crazy. I can't take it anymore. I hit the wall. I'm losing my mind. I'm arguing with my spouse, my kids. And in a way, to me, that's a really positive thing, that people are feeling more open to sharing what's really going on and what's really happening. I mean, because the studies showed, I've seen, on your platform, so much talk about it, where mental health issues, emotional health issues, where as a society, we don't like to talk about it, which is terrible. But it's now becoming very, very comfortable to talk about burnout. And you've had a lot of companies that are trying to do things to help out their people. So to me, that's another thing that's, to go back what we were first talking about, like another positive outcome of the pandemic is that we're starting to finally pay attention to these issues that we pretended didn't exist all along. And we're becoming more comfortable about talking about it. It's like even on a lesser level. So the other day, I'm on a video call, and my cat jumps up on the keyboard, and my dog is barking, and my initial thinking how it was is like I'm mortified. But the other person says, "Oh no, that's great. I have a dog, I have a cat, and that's awesome." And you realize, wow, this is so much better. You don't have to have that pretense. You don't have to have that facade of, yeah, I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. Everything is wonderful. You can just be open. And I think if we could keep that, I think as a society, not to go on a tangent, but I think that'll be better for everybody. I think it'll be a good thing for the whole country, for the whole world, if we start really getting more in touch, and companies start recognizing, hey, we got to do something. Like Citigroup had a Zoom free Friday. Oh my God, just on cue. You must have heard. Zoom, you can't make that stuff up on a Zoom free Friday. And then we just made up a holiday. What was it? City Reset, where, okay, you don't have to come into work. So yeah, we see more of that. That's
and even at LinkedIn, we have what are called meeting free Fridays.
Didn't you give a whole week off too, or something?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago we did get.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago? Yeah, 2 weeks ago, they gave us what's called a rest up week. So,
Nice.
in the world of tech, we do get weeks off during, major holidays like the 4th of July or toward the end of the year. And then just as sort of a everyone wanting to experience spring or the first few weeks of fall, depending on where they are in the world.
How great would that be, right?
We all got a full week off.
Yeah, I think
can I ask a dumb question?
Years ago as well.
Wait, it can't be for everybody though, because someone has to be running the show.
Oh, of course. Yeah, no, there's definitely people who are sort of essential workers within LinkedIn. And, there's always people on call when, if something breaks and things like that. And then even our team, we have people who, take turns working 1 day a week or something like that. Fortunately, I wasn't one of them, so I'm very appreciative of the people who do. But yeah, there are people who do that. Just to make sure everything stays running, and it's sort of a well-oiled machine at this point because we do it twice a year usually.
You think they'll stay like these things will continue?
Hopefully, I think it's probably really hard for companies to take away benefits once they're added. Obviously, it's not impossible. Obviously there were a lot of unions that had really good benefits that have sort of eroded over the years, but I think it will be difficult for like the mental health stuff to go away because I think people have relied on them so heavily during all this. And from what I've heard, people are pretty open about taking advantage of them. So I'd imagine it would be costly to a company in terms of talent and retention to say like, hey, remember that thing you really liked during the pandemic? We're going to take it away now because the pandemic's gone. I don't, maybe things will scale back or they'll say like, hey, we're only going to cover this amount now instead of that amount. But I don't think they're going to just disappear immediately.
No, but I think it could get very interesting with COVID, and I think that people who were faced the brunt of it at first when there wasn't everything was kind of uncertain how things were going to be treated and how to vaccinate anyone, that they're going to be surprised to get their $150,000 bill after being in the hospital for 30 days and not being able to pay it. I feel that there still might be a fallout somewhat from that, and may even crush or put a big dent in our healthcare system, which, it remains to be seen. But there's so many factors that are coming into play. That should be something we all keep an eye out on, because it'll affect all of us. But nevertheless, it's nearing the top of the hour. Thank you very much, Andrew Seaman, for coming on the show, Job Seeker
quick, huh?
Nation. And yeah, I know it went kind of fast, though it's 30 minutes more than what his regular show is, Jack. So, so he may have felt a little bit and said, these guys can really talk. But how people can catch you and what you got going on in the next week or so coming up? Anything we need to pay attention to?
Oh, well, yeah. So obviously Fridays I have Get Hired Live. So this week we'll have Diana YK Chan on. We'll be talking about building a brand as a job seeker. And then on Monday, I'll have an edition of Get Hired, which is my weekly newsletter for job seekers out. And we're going to be talking about bridge jobs. So, there's actually quite a bit coming out from the LinkedIn news team over the next few weeks. So, it'll be exciting and busy.
Good deal. Well, thank you so much for taking time out to join us and to help our people in the audience. And of course, you've been very generous with your time. Jack, thank you very much for always being the great partner that you are. And is that Jiggles? Did you bring Jiggles along for the ride?
Jiggles, Dolly, I don't know what Dolly is. And you're quiet. I'm glad. I thought I was getting ready for them to bark. Right. They were real good.
For the rest of you, we'll be back next Wednesday as we continue to help you with your job search inquiries and questions, conundrums. Thank you very much for joining us. 1 p.m. every Wednesday. Job Seeker Nation. Continue to talk in the thread if you wish, if you still have questions. Have a great week. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's nice meeting you, Andrew. Thanks.